In the shadows of ancient Egypt, buried beneath centuries of sand and silence, lay secrets so terrifying that men would kill to keep them hidden. What you're about to discover has been systematically erased from history, burned in flames, and buried in darkness by those who claimed to serve the light. This is the story of the most dangerous gospel ever written, a text so threatening to the foundations of Christianity that the church spent over 1,000 years trying to destroy every trace of its existence. Welcome to the forbidden truth of Mary Magdalene. Chapter 1, The Forbidden Texts. December 1945. Near the town of Nag Hammadi in Upper Egypt, a peasant named Muhammad al-Samman was digging for fertilizer when his shovel struck something hard. What he unearthed would shake Christianity to its very core. 13 leather-bound papyrus books, sealed in a large earthenware jar and hidden for over 16 centuries. Among these ancient texts lay the Gospel of Mary Magdalene, a document that the early church had declared so heretical that possessing it was punishable by death. These weren't just any religious writings. They were Gnostic texts, representing a completely different form of early Christianity that had been systematically hunted down and obliterated by the Orthodox Church. The Gnostics believed in direct spiritual knowledge rather than faith through church authority. They embraced the feminine divine and taught that salvation came through inner wisdom, not institutional control. Most dangerously of all, they revered Mary Magdalene not as a repentant sinner, but as the greatest of all apostles. The discovery at Nag Hammadi revealed the extent of one of history's most successful cover-ups. For over a millennium, the Orthodox Church had waged a campaign of destruction against these alternative Christian traditions. Libraries were burned, scrolls were destroyed, and followers were persecuted with savage brutality. The Church Fathers wrote extensively about these heretical texts, but only to condemn them. They quoted fragments to refute them, but never preserved complete works. What made Mary Magdalene's gospel so terrifying to the early church leaders? The answer lies in its revolutionary teachings about the nature of divine revelation and spiritual authority. Unlike the canonical Gospels, which were written decades after Jesus' death by men who never knew him personally, Mary's gospel claimed to record private conversations between Jesus and his most beloved disciple. These weren't public teachings meant for crowds, but intimate spiritual instructions given to the one person Jesus trusted above all others. The text begins with a haunting scene. After Jesus' ascension, the disciples are gathered in despair and fear. They're terrified of sharing Christ's message because they know it will lead to their deaths. It's Mary who comforts them and encourages them to continue their mission. But then comes the truly shocking revelation. Mary begins to share visions and teachings that Jesus had given to her alone, knowledge that the other disciples had never received. This immediately creates conflict. Peter, who would become the foundation of the Orthodox Church, challenges Mary's authority. He cannot accept that Jesus would reveal his deepest secrets to a woman rather than to the male disciples. The tension between Mary's mystical, direct revelation and Peter's institutional authority becomes the fault line that would split early Christianity forever. The Gospel of Mary presents a radically different vision of salvation. Instead of emphasizing sin, guilt, and the need for institutional mediation, it teaches that each person carries divine light within themselves. Knowledge, not faith, becomes the path to spiritual liberation. The material world isn't inherently evil, but simply an illusion that must be transcended through understanding rather than through suffering and sacrifice. Most subversively, Mary's gospel suggests that Jesus' most profound teachings were given not to the male disciples who would establish the church, but to a woman whose wisdom they rejected. This challenged the very foundation of patriarchal religious authority that was taking hold in the early Christian communities. If Mary Magdalene was indeed the beloved disciple, the one who understood Jesus most deeply, then the entire structure of Orthodox Christianity was built on the suppression of feminine spiritual wisdom. The early church fathers recognized the existential threat these ideas posed. If people could achieve salvation through direct spiritual knowledge rather than through church sacraments and priestly authority, what need would there be for the institution they were building? If women could be spiritual teachers and leaders equal to men, How could they maintain their monopoly on religious power? The answer was systematic destruction and deliberate character assassination that would last for centuries. Chapter 2, the 13th disciple. The canonical Gospels paint a mysterious portrait of Mary Magdalene. She appears suddenly in Jesus' ministry, identified only as the woman from whom 7 demons had been cast out. She's present at the crucifixion, when the male disciples have fled in terror. She's the first witness to the resurrection, trusted with the most important message in Christian history. Yet beyond these crucial moments, she remains largely invisible in the official record. The Gospel of Mary reveals why. According to her own text, Mary Magdalene wasn't just another follower, or even just another apostle. She was the 13th disciple, the one chosen to receive Jesus' most secret teachings. While the 12 male disciples represented the exoteric, public face of Christianity, Mary embodied the esoteric tradition, the hidden wisdom that could only be transmitted to those ready to receive it. The Gospel describes how Jesus would withdraw with Mary for private conversations that the other disciples weren't permitted to hear. These weren't romantic encounters, despite later church propaganda, but intensive spiritual training sessions. Jesus was preparing Mary to carry forward the deepest mysteries of his teaching, knowledge that would be too dangerous to entrust to those who might misuse it for worldly power. In one of the most striking passages, Mary describes a vision in which Jesus explains the soul's journey through cosmic spheres after death. This isn't the simple heaven and hell cosmology that would later dominate Christian thought, but a complex mystical map of spiritual ascension. The soul must pass through various powers and principalities, each representing different forms of ignorance and illusion that keep humans trapped in material existence. What makes this vision particularly threatening to Orthodox Christianity is its emphasis on knowledge over faith. The soul isn't saved by believing the right doctrines or performing the right rituals, but by understanding the true nature of reality. This understanding comes through direct mystical experience, not through institutional teaching. Every person carries within themselves the capacity for this revelation, making priests and bishops unnecessary intermediaries. The other disciples' reaction to Mary's teachings reveals the gender dynamics that would shape Christianity for millennia. When Mary finishes sharing her vision, Peter explodes with rage. He cannot accept that Jesus would reveal such profound secrets to a woman while keeping them hidden from the male disciples. His masculinity, his authority, and his entire worldview are threatened by the possibility that a woman might have superior spiritual knowledge. Andrew joins Peter in questioning Mary's credibility, suggesting that her teachings are too strange and unlike Jesus' public ministry to be authentic. But Levi, who may represent the Gospel's author, defends Mary and rebukes the other disciples for their jealousy and small-mindedness. He reminds them that Jesus clearly loved Mary more than any of them and trusted her with knowledge they couldn't understand. This conflict wasn't just about individual personalities, but represented 2 fundamentally different visions of what Christianity should become. Peter's faction would emphasize institutional authority, doctrinal orthodoxy, and hierarchical control. Mary's tradition valued direct spiritual experience, mystical knowledge, and the equality of all souls regardless of gender. The winner of this battle would determine the future of the entire Christian movement. The Gospel of Mary suggests that Jesus himself anticipated this conflict and deliberately chose Mary to preserve the esoteric tradition precisely because she would be marginalized and forgotten. The hidden wisdom would survive in the shadows, while the public church grew powerful and corrupt. Generations of mystics and Gnostics would carry forward Mary's teachings in secret, always knowing that discovery meant persecution and death. But the text also contains a darker implication. If Mary Magdalene truly was Jesus' most trusted disciple and the recipient of his deepest teachings, then everything the Orthodox Church built over the following centuries was founded on a fundamental deception. The apostolic succession that claims to trace back to Peter might be illegitimate if Peter himself had rejected and suppressed the authentic tradition preserved by Mary. This is why her gospel couldn't simply be dismissed or ignored. It had to be actively destroyed and her reputation systematically demolished. The church couldn't afford to let people discover that the woman they had demonized as a prostitute might actually have been the greatest apostle of all. Chapter 3. The sacred feminine erased. The transformation of Mary Magdalene from apostle to prostitute represents one of history's most successful character assassinations. This wasn't accidental confusion or innocent misinterpretation, but a deliberate campaign to erase the feminine divine from Christianity and establish permanent male dominance over spiritual authority. The process took centuries to complete and required the systematic rewriting of early Christian history. In the earliest gospel traditions, Mary Magdalene appears as a prominent leader and teacher. The Gospel of John presents her as the first apostle, the one chosen to announce the resurrection to the others. Early Christian communities in Egypt and Syria revered her as equal to Peter and the other male disciples. Some groups even considered her superior, believing that her deeper spiritual understanding made her Jesus' true successor. But as Christianity spread throughout the Roman Empire and began to organize itself into institutional structures, the feminine elements became increasingly problematic. Roman society was deeply patriarchal, and any religious movement that promoted women's spiritual equality would face immediate resistance from both secular authorities and potential male converts. The practical politics of church growth demanded the suppression of feminine leadership. The first step was subtle theological manipulation. Church fathers began emphasizing the sinfulness of sexuality and the spiritual danger posed by women's bodies. They taught that women were inherently more susceptible to demonic influence and spiritual deception. This created a theological framework in which feminine spiritual authority became almost contradictory, since women were supposedly less capable of receiving divine revelation. Pope Gregory the Great delivered the killing blow in 591 when he officially declared that Mary Magdalene, Mary of Bethany, and the unnamed sinful woman who anointed Jesus' feet were all the same person. This composite figure combined the spiritual authority of the apostle with the sexual shame of the prostitute, effectively neutralizing Mary's threat to male ecclesiastical power while providing a useful model of female repentance and submission. This wasn't biblical scholarship, but political manipulation. The Eastern Orthodox Church never accepted Gregory's identification, maintaining the distinction between these different women. But in the Western Church, the prostitute identity became so entrenched that questioning it was considered heretical. Mary Magdalene, the apostle, disappeared from Christian consciousness, replaced by Mary Magdalene, the penitent whore. The erasure of feminine spiritual authority extended far beyond Mary Magdalene herself. Early Christian communities had included numerous women in leadership roles. Phoebe was called a deacon by Paul. Junia was described as prominent among the apostles. Priscilla taught alongside her husband and even instructed the eloquent Apollos. But as the institutional church consolidated its power, these women were systematically written out of history or relegated to subordinate roles. The Gnostic traditions that preserved feminine wisdom became particular targets for persecution. These communities often featured female teachers and prophets who claimed direct revelation from the divine. They spoke of Sophia, divine wisdom personified as feminine, and taught that spiritual enlightenment required the integration of both masculine and feminine principles. Such ideas were anathema to the increasingly patriarchal Orthodox Church. The Council of Nicaea in 325 marked a turning point in this campaign of suppression. Emperor Constantine's conversion had made Christianity the favored religion of the Roman Empire, but this political triumph came at the cost of spiritual diversity. The council standardized Christian doctrine and began the process of determining which texts would be considered canonical scripture. Notably, absent from these deliberations were any representatives of the Gnostic traditions or the feminine spiritual lineages. The bishops, who gathered to decide Christianity's future, were exclusively male and predominantly aligned with the Petrine tradition that emphasized institutional authority over direct revelation. The Gospel of Mary and other texts preserving feminine wisdom never had a chance of inclusion in the official canon. The destruction that followed was systematic and thorough. Gnostic libraries were burned, alternative Christian communities were persecuted, and anyone caught possessing heretical texts faced imprisonment or death. The church that had once been persecuted for its radical message of spiritual equality became the persecutor, crushing any tradition that challenged its monopoly on divine truth. But perhaps the most insidious aspect of this erasure was how completely it succeeded in rewriting history. For over 1,000 years, the only version of early Christianity that survived was the one approved by the Orthodox Church. Generations of believers grew up never knowing that alternative traditions had ever existed. Mary Magdalene, the apostle, vanished so completely that when her gospel was finally rediscovered in 1945, even scholars initially struggled to believe it was authentic. The implications of this historical cover-up extend far beyond academic interest. If the early church systematically suppressed feminine spiritual authority and destroyed texts that preserved alternative teachings, what other essential truths might have been lost? How different might Christianity have become if Mary Magdalene's tradition had been allowed to develop alongside Peter's? These questions strike at the very heart of religious authority and challenge believers to confront uncomfortable truths about their faith's origins. Chapter 4. The dangerous truth. The Gospel of Mary Magdalene doesn't just present an alternative history of early Christianity. It offers a fundamentally different understanding of salvation, spiritual authority, and human nature that threatens the very foundations upon which institutional Christianity was built. The text's true danger lies not in what it reveals about the past, but in what it suggests about the present structures of religious power and control. At the heart of Mary's gospel is a radical redefinition of sin and salvation. The Orthodox Christian tradition teaches that humans are born sinful, separated from God by their fallen nature, and dependent on Christ's sacrifice for redemption. This creates a system of spiritual debt that can only be resolved through church, mediation, baptism, confession, communion, and clerical blessing, become necessary steps in the salvation process. Mary's gospel obliterates this entire framework. According to her teachings, there is no such thing as sin in the traditional sense. What the Orthodox Church calls sin is simply ignorance of one's true divine nature. Every human soul carries within itself the same divine spark that animated Jesus. The goal isn't to overcome sinfulness through external grace, but to awaken to the inner light that has always been present. This teaching makes the institutional church not just unnecessary, but potentially harmful. If salvation comes through inner knowledge rather than external ritual, then priests become obstacles rather than facilitators of spiritual growth. If every person can access divine truth directly, then ecclesiastical hierarchies become mechanisms of oppression rather than instruments of grace. The entire apparatus of religious authority crumbles when confronted with Mary's mystical individualism. The gospel's treatment of Jesus himself is equally subversive. Rather than emphasizing his unique divine nature or his role as cosmic sacrifice, Mary presents Jesus primarily as a teacher who achieved perfect spiritual realization and sought to guide others to the same awakening. His death wasn't a necessary atonement for human sin, but a demonstration of the soul's ability to transcend material existence entirely. Most dangerously, Mary's vision suggests that Jesus' mission was fundamentally misunderstood and corrupted by those who claimed to be his followers. The emphasis on guilt, suffering, and institutional obedience represents a betrayal of his actual teachings about inner freedom and divine knowledge. The church built in his name became the antithesis of everything he actually stood for. This interpretation explains why the Orthodox Church fought so desperately to suppress Mary's gospel and destroy every copy they could find. The text doesn't just offer an alternative Christian theology, it exposes institutional Christianity as a massive deception perpetrated on billions of believers across nearly 2 millennia. If Mary's account is authentic, then the Pope, bishops, priests, and the entire ecclesiastical hierarchy are not just misguided, but actively working against Christ's true message. The personal implications are equally unsettling for individual Christians. Believers who have spent their lives seeking salvation through church attendance, prayer, and moral behavior discover that they've been pursuing the wrong goals through the wrong methods. The guilt and fear that Orthodox Christianity cultivates as motivation for spiritual growth become obstacles to the inner peace and divine knowledge that Mary describes as humanity's true inheritance. But the danger of Mary's gospel extends beyond Christianity itself. The text's emphasis on direct spiritual knowledge and inner authority challenges all forms of religious and political control. If individuals can access ultimate truth through their own mystical experience, then they become immune to manipulation by any external authority. The implications for social control are staggering. This is why Mary's gospel remains dangerous even today, nearly 2,000 years after it was written, and 75 years after its rediscovery. Modern religious institutions still depend on the same mechanisms of authority and control that the early church used to suppress her teachings. The text's publication in academic circles has been carefully contained within scholarly contexts that limit its popular impact. Churches that do acknowledge the Gospel of Mary typically dismiss it as interesting but non-canonical, maintaining that only the biblical texts carry true spiritual authority. They rarely engage with the substance of Mary's teachings or confront the implications of her alternative understanding of Christian origins. The same protective instincts that led to the text's original suppression continue to operate in more subtle but equally effective ways. Yet the truth refuses to remain buried forever. Each generation of seekers rediscovers Mary's wisdom and recognizes its power to liberate human consciousness from centuries of spiritual oppression. The Gospel's teaching that divine knowledge is available to all people, regardless of gender, education, or institutional affiliation, continues to inspire those who refuse to accept secondhand spiritual authority. The question facing modern readers is whether they have the courage to confront what Mary Magdalene's gospel reveals about their faith, their institutions, and themselves. The text offers liberation from guilt, fear, and external control, but only at the cost of abandoning comfortable certainties and embracing the terrifying responsibility of direct spiritual knowledge. This is why the Gospel of Mary Magdalene remains the most dangerous book in the world, not because it threatens any particular church or doctrine, but because it reveals the infinite spiritual potential that lies dormant within every human soul, waiting for the courage to awaken. That truth has always been too dangerous for those who profit from keeping humanity asleep, and it remains just as threatening today as it was when the first copies were hidden in the Egyptian desert 16 centuries ago.